Welcome back. The theme of our next session is archaeology. Professor Shadhin Shen, the renowned archaeologist from the Department of Archaeology, Jahangirnagar University, Dhaka, will present his lecture on reducing archaeological data into source of early Indian history, a conceptual and methodological critique. We invite Professor Shen to deliver his talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay. Let me just share my presentation first, because we do not have much time, I think. My presentation is visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So first, the routine work, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Professor Nupur Dasgupta, for considering me as a resource person for this workshop, where I am just seeing that many of the stalwarts of Indian history are present. So I am humbled and privileged to be a resource person in this workshop. First, I would like to start with the trouble. In fact, in one of our recently edited volume, our introduction was titled as Trouble of Thinking, about the archaeology of early medieval and the medieval in the Ganges Brahmaputra Meghna basin. So why we have identified this as a trouble of thinking? I think most of the participants here are postgraduate students and research scholars, and we don't have much time. So I would like to start with pointing at the troubles of thinking about archaeology, especially in reference to Bangladesh, West Bengal, northeastern part of South Asia. So what is the trouble? Trouble can be identified from many perspectives. First, the trouble is with us, the archaeologists, who are doing archaeology in South Asia, mostly from a very conventional and established perspective, which can be identified as culture historical, that I will point out later. And second trouble is the dominance of textual sources and epigraphic sources in the history of early India, especially what is known as ancient and medieval period. And in fact, when we talk about archaeology, sometimes I just confuse that what is the task of archaeology in the writing of history of South Asia. Sometimes I feel that the archaeology is reduced only as a source without proper consideration or without any engagement with some fundamental and key conceptual aspects of archaeology, especially when you talk about the historical archaeology of South Asia. So let me start with the elaboration of some of these key fundamentals about which we are not very comfortable as archaeologists. So therefore, the title of the introduction of our recently edited volume, where we mentioned about the trouble of thinking about the archaeology, the trouble here is not only about the difficulties in engaging with the archaeological sites or artifacts or established interpretations in history. For us, the trouble is also about the ways in which we locate ourselves as archaeologists doing archaeology of specific periods or temporal frames, which are dominated by specific practices, engagements, dispositions, and especially the traditions of scholarship. Even when debates and discussions are explicit on various aspects of history, on the historical period. For example, I think most of the students here or research scholars here are very well aware of about the debates on early medieval period or medieval period, about the debates on polity, about the debates on the society, about the debates on nature of the society, about the debates on the aspects of various kinds of religious traditions and so on. But in these entire traditions of debates, it is very difficult. It is really very uncomfortable to find the ways in which archaeology or archaeological data is treated. Even when debates and discussions are explicit on various aspects of history and historical periods, or even when occasional references to archaeological findings are mentioned in support of debating parties, we hardly find engagement with the conceptual and methodological aspects of archaeology in South Asia. Like most other interrelated disciplines, archaeology as a disciplinary practice began with modernity, and for us, with the colonial modernity. The entwinement of colonial projects and the study of material cultures of non-Western societies, cultures, and religions were the main domain or main space in which archaeology developed in Europe as well as in South Asia. As many archaeologists have pointed out, like David Lowenthal, that past has become a foreign land, a domain of otherness, an exotic world to be discovered, celebrated, collected, classified, and used as an objective facts. And many of you have watched the very popular movie on Indiana Jones. And most of the archaeologists or students of archaeology start to think about taking the profession of archaeology after watching Indiana Jones. This is not a hypothesis. It was the result of a survey conducted in England among the students of archaeology of various universities. And most of them came to archaeology, conceptualizing archaeology as something adventurous, as something to go for exotic discovery or going for taming the wildness and so on. But in reality, archaeology is not like that in any way. No archaeologist is like Indiana Jones. So there are many people or many scholars who have talked about the history of archaeological thought. For example, I am very fond of Bruce Trigger, or you are well aware of the scholars like Bernard Cohn, Ronald Illnen, and our Taputi Guhu Thakurata. And there are many others from Europe also, like Gavin Lucas or Julian Thomas. They have all addressed the development and changes of the definition, methodology, and theoretical perspectives of archaeology under the colonial projects of modernities and, of course, under the nationalist projects. In fact, archaeology was a part and parcel of claiming the territoriality, claiming the sovereignty, claiming the newness of the nation states which developed in Europe in the after the Enlightenment period. And the dominance or preference of the objects over the material, over the text, also was a key issue in the development of archaeology. If we read, for example, Gavin Lucas's works, then we'll find out that archaeology was specifically developed in reference to what is known as the period of prehistory, where we don't have any written source. or there is a absence of written source. One of the most crucial and critical domain of archaeology has been, of course, the field. Following the cue from the development of colonial anthropology and the ethnography of the other cultures, field became a space for scientifically and rationally justifying the civilizing missions. Critical engagements with the concepts of field and the field methods and techniques in archaeology have been an essential part of critical rethinking of the definitions, objectives, scope, and plurality of archaeology. And even in these days, field work and data collected from the field have been a critical reference point for proving the oldness, for proving the validity or factuality of many textual sources. For example, I was reading Dr. Konark Sinha's very fascinating book. And at the same time, I was reading about the news that new excavation has started in the Purana Killa of Delhi. To prove that, basically, that Purana Killa was established on the capital city of Indraprastha, mentioned in the Mahabharata. So there was a certain tradition of archaeological research, probably pioneered by Bibilal, to find out the cities and places mentioned in the epics and different religious textual sources. And it is also a lineage from the Western tradition of archaeology, where there is a tradition of biblical archaeology in which scholars are still looking for the places or sites mentioned in the Bible or mentioned in the Judeo-Christian religious text. Archaeological concepts and methodologies have been broadly categorized, which we are not very well aware of, probably, as, for example, culture historical approach, processual approach, post-processual approach, interpretative approach, symmetrical approach, phenomenological approach, and so on. And currently and recently, there are many intersecting paradigms of archaeological concepts, which are working on different contemporary issues as well as the issues related to the recent development of heritage studies or cultural resource management. Therefore, archaeology cannot be identified as a specifically unitary discipline or unilinear discipline. There are many interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary aspects of archaeology, and gradually archaeology is incorporating many of the traditions or contemporary traditions from different other disciplines. Like we all know about geoarchaeology, we all know about bioarchaeology, we talk about paleoecology or historical ecology, specifically in reference to the recent discussions and debates on climate change and global warming. There is, of course, various important contributions from paleoclimatology in archaeology. During the last decade, there are immense contribution from genetics in archaeology. There is aspects of gender archaeology, and there are many disciplines or concepts which are being continuously adopted and incorporated in archaeology. But some of the themes or some of the aspects are fundamentals to archaeology. In South Asia, the development of archaeology and its concepts and method have largely been dominated by a culture historical approach, where a normative view of culture is combined with evolutionary and diffusionist models. Even these days, when we talk about archaeology or archaeological research, in most of the research topics or most of the research projects, we find an inclination towards some kind of a diffusionist model where we look for the connectedness, we look for connectivity, we look for interregional connections, and so on. And we also talk about mostly macro-regional aspects. For example, we talk about Buddhism in Eastern India. We talk about the rise of undevelopment of Vajrayana philosophy in India, Eastern India. Or even we talk about Brahmanical settlements or Buddhist settlements or Muslim settlements in different parts of South Asia. We talk about a homogeneous narrative of urbanization, like first urbanism, second urbanism, and third urbanism, and so on. And if we just engage with the works of Brajadulal Chattopadhyay, who is one of the very few historians who have engaged with the archaeological data from a very different perspective, we can think about the different scale of archaeological research in different spaces. And he also proposed that about the chronology of South Asia, that whether it is possible to apply different kinds of chronological frameworks in different parts of South Asia. So, in fact, often the discussions on concepts and methods of archaeology in questioning and engaging with established and normalized historical narratives are considered as blasphemous and irrelevant. The trouble is also in this taken for granted relationship between archaeology and history. I do not intend to offend anyone, and I do not intend to claim that archaeology in any way is superior to the textual sources. Rather, I would like to point about the problems in archaeology in which both parties, archaeologists and historians alike, could be identified as sharing the same sort of understanding and conceptual framework. Often I wonder, for example, about our friends and colleagues working with, for example, epigraphs or sculptures without having very little or no idea about the context, landscapes, archaeological sites, and peoples of the places from where particular inscriptions or sculptures are found. You all know that in many cases, images in recent days, very high resolution images of the inscriptions are available. Good images of the sculptures are available. So it is possible to decipher an inscription or interpret a sculpture or icon only from the images, or just going into some kind of collections or museums without any essential understanding of the context from where these inscriptions or these sculptures or any other kind of objects were found. Interpretation of text of an inscription or styles and attributes of sculptures are often devoid of an understanding of the archaeological context. I am not claiming that interpretations are wrong, or this approach to sources like the epigraphs or art historical materials or even monumental remains are limited or erroneous. Rather, I want to point at the lack of engagement between different disciplinary concepts and methods, and the reification of sources and interpretations without any alternative perspectives of verifications. I refer to my favorite quote from a very great scholar on Buddhism, Gregory Chopin. Quote, scholars of Indian Buddhism have taken canonical mosaic rules and formal literary descriptions of the monastic ideal preserved in very late manuscripts and treated them as if they were accurate reflections of the religious life and career of actual practicing Buddhist monks in early India. Such a procedure has, of course, placed archaeology and epigraphy in a very awkward position. If then archaeology and epigraphy are to be in the service of a history based on written sources of this kind, then they are going to have to support and amplify something that very probably did not exist, unquote. And another archaeologist a famous archaeologist of Buddhism, Robin Cunningham, has also said that Buddhist research is dominated by textually based scholars or by historians of art and architecture, relegating archaeologists to a solitary role of primary producer, not venturing further than the description of excavated remains. I do not intend to trivialize the textual sources. We have extraordinary interpretations from the textual sources or epigraphic sources. But what I want to point at is that archaeological concepts and methods are not fundamental to most of the historians' understanding. And I am not claiming that there is a binary opposition between archaeology and history as discipline. Neither am I asserting that archaeological interpretations are superior to the interpretations of textual sources in terms of objectivity and value neutrality. Like history, archaeology has its own limitations and debates regarding the objectivity, value neutrality, false claims, misinterpretation of material culture and excavated findings to favor racist, nationalist, and fantastic claims. We all know about the archaeology of Babri Masjid as a very good example. The racist archaeology of Nazism, or the ethnocentric archaeology of Zionism, or the statist archaeology to support modern territorial claims are well known to everyone. We are also familiar with the rise of religious and dogmatic nationalisms in South Asia, and frequent reference to archaeological research to validate the claims as if archaeology as a discipline focusing on material cultures is essentially more acceptable or rational to justify or validate any claims about the past. If we attend to the origin of archaeology as a modern discipline, discourses on the text versus object, the objectivity of objects in opposition to the subjectivity of the textual sources were central. But archaeologists these days do not conform to any of these binary between objectivity and subjectivity. The domain of prehistory was the central focal of these debates. But what we are talking about is not prehistory. We are talking about the discipline which is known as historical archaeology. Often if we come back to the period of written records, the debates become intense, often unnecessarily. In the domain of historical archaeology, it is the archaeologists of South Asia who have remained satisfied to corroborate the textual sources, and the historians and the dominant actors stayed away from the basic conceptual understanding of archaeological concepts and methods. We may point at many examples or events in support of my observations. Considering the time constraint and aim of this workshop, I intend to stay focused on some fundamental aspects, especially in reference to undivided Bengal and eastern part of South Asia. And I would like to point out to these aspects, not only on the basis of conceptually or theoretically. In fact, we are working in the field of archaeology, especially in the northwestern part of Bangladesh and southwestern part of Bangladesh. And also I have explored and visited several other sites in West Bengal, in Bihar, and in several other places. This is our understanding based or stemmed from our experience and our problems, our questions, which we have encountered when we try to corroborate our archaeological findings with the textual narratives. And I would like to focus on a few of those fundamental aspects. And I have talked about all these things in this slide, but one of the things that I must point at is the notion of archaeological culture. You all read or talk about PGW culture, painted ware culture, painted grey ware culture, NBPW culture, black and red ware culture, or megalithic culture, and so on. What does it mean by these archaeological cultures? And archaeologists have discussed and debated over this notion of culture. And this notion of culture was developed in colonial period in reference to a special trademark artifact, which trademark artifact was identified as representing some particular people, even representing some particular race or ethnic group or some nation. And interestingly, for example, when you talk about Mahabharata, you look for the PGW culture. When you talk about Buddhism and urbanism, the second urbanism in the all historic period, you talk about NDPW culture. So these notions of culture are also related to the archaeological fieldwork, especially archaeological survey and archaeological excavation. And it started from the time of especially Sir Mortimer Wheeler. In fact, in most of the archaeological excavations in South Asia, the Wheelerian Kenyanian method is still predominant. The Wheelerian Kenyanian method comes from two prominent archaeologists. One is Sir Mortimer Wheeler, another is Professor Kathleen Kenyon. And both of them at that time, in the beginning of the 20th century, conducted archaeological excavation in different parts of the world. Especially Mortimer Wheeler is known as the father of scientific archaeology in India or in South Asia. And I will just show that, for example, you can see this section of Brahmagiri drawn by Mortimer Wheeler, the left one. So you can see how he has drawn a section of archaeological excavation and identify different layers with the notion of culture, Andhra culture, megalithic culture, Stone Age culture, so on. And on the right side, you can see the one section drawing, a combination of 4 sections, which were drawn following the methods, excavation methods, which was developed by Edward Harris, and which is identified as the most holistic approach to archaeological excavation. So let us go on to these key aspects of archaeological concepts which I was talking about. For example, first we have to understand the notion of space, scale, coverage, resolution, and intensity in archaeology. What is space? You all know about space, but in archaeology, space is very crucial, and spatial context is more crucial to understand the meaning of any object or any artifact. And we can differentiate the space subjectively from micro to macro scale, from a very small area to a trans-regional area. So this space is also related to the scale, where we can differentiate or we can define scale in terms of the horizontal distribution of any archaeological material, whether it is a site, whether it is defined as a settlement, or whether it is defined as any other thing. So scale is also very important, and coverage, resolution, intensity are related to the way in which we work to identify the distribution of different kinds of materials and sites or settlement on a particular landscape. And the second important aspect of archaeology is the archaeological context. It is very different than the normal notion of context or contextualization, what we talk about. Archaeological context here is a 3-dimensional concept where we talk about space, form, and time. And it is mostly about the interrelationship. The interrelationship among objects or material culture with the other material cultures or objects associated with it, and with the space where we are finding those material cultures. So space here is also not an empty one. Space here is also the landscape. Space here is also the scalar definition of the space. Scale here is also about many of the other things. Soil is considered as an artifact, about the vegetation, about the topography, about many other aspects of the landscapes, which can be defined as material culture. In fact, we sometimes talk about the materiality of landscape. We talk about the materiality of, for example, the environment. We talk about the materiality of ecology. So its context can be defined is a kind of interrelationship. And if we talk about the interrelationship, then we have to depart from the established notion of this archaeological culture and established notion of these only trademark artifact oriented definition and understanding of past and cultures, where we just identify some trademarks such as NBPW, such as PGW, such as one particular specific variety of sculpture in terms of some dynasties like Pala sculptures or Shena sculptures, or in terms like some particular religious centric monuments like Brahmonical and Buddhist, and at the same time identifying the settlements in terms of that religious one. And third thing is that the idea of the verticality and horizontality of space. In archaeological fieldwork or in archaeological understanding of time, horizontal and vertical is very important. And most importantly, when we talk about archaeology, we do not necessarily use the time frame or periodization following the established one, like ancient, medieval, modern, or early historic, early medieval, medieval, and so on. I will show that particular aspects of periodization in terms of archaeological stratigraphy, which I have already mentioned. The archaeological stratigraphy is almost vertical, and the dominant modality of understanding archaeological stratigraphy in South Asia is mostly vertical, and the scale of the excavations are very smaller in terms of the entire settlements. If we consider most of the urban centers of the early historic period, and if you just go through the excavation reports, you cannot see in most of the cases any stratigraphy. You will see some description of the artifacts. You will see very small scale excavation, even when you see some kind of section drawing in terms of some description of the layers or description of the, for example, artifacts. And you will find that on the basis of a very small scale excavation of a very huge site, the generalizations were made, the conclusions were drawn, and those conclusions were never been challenged or questioned. And the periodization was based on either on the basis of the archaeological culture or on the basis of the dominant dynastic chronology, like Mauryan period, like Pala period, like Gupta period. For example, if you just look at the excavation reports of Bangor, which of course is very old, or excavation report of Karnashiborna, we will find the same concept and methodology of illustrating or representing the stratigraphy. And we have talked about the archaeology of stratigraphy, and what I was referring to as horizontal and vertical, this is only for the research scholars, I think. So this is a section, and I understand any archaeological settlement, both vertically, for example, top to bottom, and horizontally, from one side to another side. It's just a schematic drawing of one urban settlement, and you can see the variability of features and artifacts in any different kinds of strata or different kinds of feature. And the dating of any archaeological objects, when we talk about archaeological context and just move aside from the stylistical dating or formal aspects of dating, then we have to talk about the archaeological context. And archaeological context, for example, you can see a section, a schematic section, and here you are getting different kinds of artifacts from different period. And if we consider the site formation process and the archaeological context, there is a great difference between systemic context and the archaeological context. And there is, in between, there are formation processes. And particularly when we talk about Bengal, which is dominated by different fluvial processes, their natural processes are very important to identify in the meaning of any artifact. Even the dating of artifact can be very erroneous if we do not consider the archaeological context and the formation processes. For example, we can find NBPW mixed with other potsherd or other material culture. At the same time, within that, we can just get a bottle of Coke, a Coca-Cola bottle. In that sense, if we do not consider that Coca-Cola bottle, or if we do not we fail to recognize the Coca-Cola bottle, then we will just date the particular objects and particular place as early history. But it is essentially when the Coca-Cola bottle comes into the assemblies, then the date becomes completely recent. So we have to now talk about the reuse of the materials, which is very common in most of the archaeological sites of Bengal, because most of the archaeological sites of Bengal are structural mounds. We found monumental remains, and in the urban centers, we also find different deposits from different periods. These are for students to show what is there in archaeological sections and archaeological context. This is another interesting pit. Pits are the most common thing in any part of South Asia and any part of the world. And if you get a particularly datable object within the pit, the date of the pit and the object will be different than the date and the nature of the meaning of the objects if we find it from outside the pit. And now I will talk about, which is very important, regarding the context of the epigraphs. And we are facing tremendous difficulty when we try to correlate the descriptions and the donation of lands in particular administrative unit, the place of the donee. So if we just try to correlate with those facts in the inscriptions, which is of course a normative one, and with the archaeological context, then often we cannot relate the archaeological context with the normative text in the inscription. For example, we have already written about the discrepancies regarding the Gupta period settlements in the Borengri region. This map has been taken from one of our friends' paper, Arlo Griffith's paper, where the find spots of most of the Gupta period inscriptions have been located. And for example, if I refer to the Damodarpur one or Paharpur one, then we have to first read about these first paragraph of the report, how the inscription was found, how it was handed over to another person, and how the impression of the inscription reached the scholar who has deciphered it. Often, the scholar had not visited the context of the inscription, find of the inscription. For example, if we consider about the Damodarpur copper plate inscription, 5 copper plates were found from the same place, and it covers more than 1.5 century. And we have to ask the question, why 5 copper plates were found from the same place? Same can be talked about the Beloa copper plate inscriptions. 2 copper plate inscriptions were found from the same plate. For Damodarpur copperplate inscription, we have surveyed the place and we haven't found any material culture which correspond to the Gupta period or post-Gupta period, or the period belonging to that particular time frame. For Beloa or Silimpur stone slab inscription, we have surveyed the places, and in Beloa, we have conducted archaeological excavation. This is the right side. This is a new inscription we have discovered from the treasury of the government, and currently it is, I have sent it to our friend Roysuku Furui to decipher it. And this is another new inscription, and you all aware of this inscription from Rajvita. For example, in this place, we are finding most of the inscriptions. We are finding Beloa, we are finding Biala inscription, we are finding Silimpur stone slab inscription, we are finding a Naudova inscription that we have found, not yet deciphered. We have found another inscription of Narayan Pala that we have not yet discovered, and we have found another stone slab inscription from another place from Ghoraghat. So there is a concentration of copperplate inscriptions and stone slab inscription in this particular zone of Ghoraghat in Dinajpur region, Ghoraghat, Kalai, and Khetlali Upazila. And it is very difficult to correlate the timing, dating of the archaeological settlements with the places mentioned in the inscriptions. There are several places. For example, the place where the land is being donated, the place where the donee belonged, the administrative unit in which the places belongs. There are, in one particular inscription, there is mentions of donating land in three different geographical or administrative units. And the conventional method of identifying the place names is comparing the place names with the modern place names. But we are getting from our database similar place names as is mentioned in the inscriptions. And we are getting archaeological sites. For example, for Silimpur, we have found a settlement called Baligram, and the name of the place mentioned in the Silimpur stone slab is the Baligrama. If we just correlate these two places, then the dating of the archaeological dating of the Baligram goes far back from the inscription or the paleographic dating of the inscriptions. And for Beloa, we have excavated sites of Beloa, and for the students, you can see different kinds of context of archaeological material that we have identified during our survey. And this is interesting kind of reuse. You all notice this kind of reuse in Bengal and in South Asia. That, for example, these bricks were dug from a particular site and used to construct a particular house. And if we find, for example, shards of NPPW from these walls, we cannot date it to early historic period. This is the problem with the archaeological context, and this is why we have to take archaeological context in consideration. And these are different kinds of context in which we are finding different kinds of materials. But these materials are not trademark materials. If you consider, for example, NBPW, it is not more than 10% of the pottery which was used by the people at a particular time. So we are only focusing on some particular trademark object and just neglecting the others. And these are different kinds of context of archaeological materials we are getting in northwestern part of Bangladesh. And now we come to Beloa. We have excavated one site in Beloa and found one Brahmanical temple. The problem of identifying this temple as Brahmanical, or the problem of identifying a particular settlement as Brahmanical or as Buddhist can be explained just by showing this site. Firstly, this structure was built as a Brahmanical temple. And when we just interpreted the archaeological stratigraphy, we have found out that in the later period, these temple was deserted and used as a normal habitational space. And later, it was also used for other normal habitational practices. So what will be the identity of this structure? If we just identified only as Brahmanical, then all the other characteristics of this site or of this structure are neglected. And at the same time, if we just try to identify the chronology in terms of ancient or medieval, or in terms of early medieval and medieval, we cannot just date different periods of archaeological stratigraphy. In that sense, we define archaeological stratigraphy in terms of, for example, construction of the site, for example, reconstruction of the site, abandonment of the site, or some kind of reuse of the site. So these are the events on the basis of which we try to understand the chronology of a particular site in archaeology, which might not be corroborative to the dominant historical time frames. And the same can be applied for the Paharpur or Shompur Mahavihara, where there was a copper plate, Gupta period copper plate, and we haven't found any material culture just representing the Gupta period. There was a structure, for example, just underneath the present central shrine. But that doesn't mean that this central shrine or the earlier central shrine was built during the Gupta period. So I talked about these problems with Professor Brojuduro Chattopadhyay when he was with us, and also with Roysuku Kurui and several other scholars. And we have just tried to understand why we are not getting any kind of material dating to Gupta period. At the same time, we are getting the inscription, copper plate inscription of the Gupta period from the Paharpur. Our interpretation is that copper plate inscription as a normative document was quite movable. In this sense, we have to consider the archaeological provenance and provenience of archaeological material. In that sense, finally, we have to talk about the context of the archaeological objects. If we consider an inscription as an archaeological object, then we have to think about that archaeological object can move from one place to another. And as a particular document of a particular land, as a land grant, people could move with those land grants, and people could store those land grant in a particular place. And in Belova also, we have found two copper plate inscriptions. In one copper plate inscriptions on 3rd Vigrahapala, we have found mention of a place called Belva, which can be correlated with Belva. But now no other place names can be correlated in the entire area of the site. So these are the landscape context, and you can see how we periodize for the students. For example, this is the level of a period of flood. This is a period of structural activity. This is a period where there was no structural activity. There was several floods which influenced the Paharpur Shompur Mahavihara. And at the same time, the river, which is known as Choto Jamuna River, also moved several times. And these contextual aspects or landscape aspects have to be correlated with the stratigraphy of Paharpur Mahavihara. And at the same time, the identification of the Buddhist monasteries as universities must be questioned, because we have interpreted that the Shompur Mahavihara, along with another Viharika mentioned in the inscription of Dharmapala in the Kolkata Museum, which was deciphered by Roysuku Kurui, just detects that shows that the monastic establishment was not an isolated one. it was also related to the other aspects of the region. For example, the agrarian activities. For example, the other activities. For example, the trade route or exchange networks. And if we consider, for example, the Mahasthan as an urban center, there is also some kind of neglect toward about the zone which is not the urban center. And you can see, for example, some of the sites. I will just keep these slides, which were supplied to me by Professor Jean-François Salle. These are some of the remains from the excavation, Bangladesh-France joint excavation. And you can see very small areas of the entire Mahasthan Gor, which is the urban center, was excavated. So we have to remember that we are generalizing about the stratigraphy of the urban center, which is quite a thick stratigraphy, or more than 10 meters thick. And we are generalizing on the basis of very smaller scale excavation. And in the left side, you will see many archaeological sites around these urban center. And our focus is mostly on the urban center. So what about this hinterland zone or neighboring zone? What about the zone where we are not finding any archaeological material? That is why we say in archaeology that presence of archaeological data is as important as the absence of archaeological data. Absence is very important to be understood or interpreted. And this is another two sites which can problematize our understanding of identifying any settlement on religious terms. These two sites are in Dinajpur, and here we are finding Buddhist structure were converted into Brahmanical structure. So how can we identify this structure as either Brahmanical or Buddhist? And in later period, it was also used as some kind of habitational purposes. So these are the problems we are talking about in terms of archaeology. And you can see that for the students in the southern part of Bangladesh, we are getting archaeological material just close to the coastal region, and we do not know the nature of these archaeological structures. And you can see the context of the archaeological material like pottery, which were redeposited by I was talking about the natural processes, by water flow of the river. This potsherd was deposited from one place to another. So the dating of the potsherd and the place will be dependent on the context of these archaeological objects. And this is the archaeological sites in the Sundarban area. So I am just talking about some problems, and I would like to also reiterate that I am not claiming that archaeology is superior to history or textual sources. I am not also asserting that archaeologists are very good at their work in the field, because in most of the cases, archaeological interpretations are done by archaeologists. The Babri Masjid, during the Babri Masjid excavation, the interpretations was offered by the professional archaeologists, and archaeologists are as liable to error as the historians. We have to just humbly talk to each other, and humbly I would like to just ask everybody who are working with the text or textual sources to consider some of the key fundamental concepts of archaeology when we deal with archaeology or history in a simultaneously. So it is a continuous process, and thank you everybody. I don't know how much time I have taken. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such an insightful talk. Now I request Professor Shen to take up the questions. Questions are posed in the chat box.
Okay.
There is one question from Aftab Mansoor, and he's asking Professor Shadhin Sen, how can we interpret cultural landscape by the help of archaeological elements?
Okay. Thank you, Aftab. Especially the concept of cultural landscape is a very recent one. It has developed within the paradigm of heritage management. And the notion of cultural landscape was developed by several transnational agencies like ICOM, ICOMOS, and especially UNESCO. Here, they talk about, by their definition, there are three types of cultural landscape, where presence of archaeological elements are not required as an essential component. In their, I think, in their third category of cultural landscape, archaeological aspects are important, but the use of the landscape and the meaning of the landscape over time, and meaning of the landscape and various landscape features, such as, for example, river, such as, for example, water, such as soil, a particular kind of landscape. For example, we can talk about the Uluru of Australia, which is also known as Ayers Rock, which is defined as a cultural landscape. And recently we have proposed to update the tentative list from Bangladesh in collaboration with Government Department of Archaeology and UNESCO. And we have proposed a proposal where we have defined Mahasthan in terms of a cultural landscape, with special reference to the Korotwa River and the present engagement with the people and the Korotwa River, Korotwa symbolic aspects, these different meanings of landscapes and archaeological sites from different communities around it. So archaeological elements are not essential to define cultural landscape. It is one of the essential component in one of the categories.
There are two more questions which are of certain general nature and would require more time, but we are running short of time actually. Our next speakers are ready. So I'm very sorry. We have had a very brilliant session. We have learned a lot from all the speakers, and Shadhin, it was really, really brilliant. I think, Pulumi, we should go to the next session. We should go to the next session.